Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francis Odum. I'm the founder of the Software Analyst Cybersecurity Research, a research and advisory firm. We primarily specialize in security operations, cloud security, as well as identity security, obviously. And we do a lot of work around helping enterprise and organizations, the vendor ecosystem for all of these emerging markets. And so one of the markets we cover extensively is the market of non-human identity. I've written an extensive research report on the ecosystem. I speak to all the vendors. I get regular briefings and help the market really just help understand how the market is moving, how the different vendors are solving the problems. And our platform has close to about 70,000 readers and subscribers globally across all of our platforms. So I guess I'm the last presenter for the day. So my goal was maybe to just ask a question, maybe just two persons of like, if there's one takeaway you're leaving today with, what would it be? Anyone wants to just maybe with a show of hands, just very quickly, like if there's one thing you feel like you're taking back to your organization today based off the conference, what would that be today? Don't kick the can. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a relevant one. Any other person? Any other one? Teamwork. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Just how fragmented this problem is, it requires a team effort. And so we've heard so many statistics today, so I'm not going to give you too much stats as part of my presentation. I'm not going to bombard you with the number of attacks or why this is a problem. I'm really hoping that based off all the presentation that has been given today, you have a good understanding of the problem, the attacks, why we're here today. And so my focus of my presentation is how are you actually going to go solve the problem, right? For some of you here who might not already have a vendor to actually solve this problem for you, how do you actually go about solving that? And so that's going to be a key part of what I try to show here. So I'm just going to very briefly talk through these 5 trends as part of my presentation. And in the back half of my presentation, I have what's happening currently within the vendor ecosystem. So the first thing I cover is just the vendor ecosystem. As I said, I speak to almost all of the vendors, quite frankly, on the market who are building some type of non-human identity capability to help enterprises solve this problem. I think from our last presenter, he spoke a lot from Elastic about the role that automating a number of these processes does. Doing this manually is extremely difficult just because of how fragmented and how difficult this problem is. And so you're going to have to leverage some type of solution. And so we've seen the vendor ecosystem has grown, right? Lots of vendors have a lot of 2023 and 2024 was quite frankly all about vendors building solutions to help enterprises solve for this problem. And so what we're seeing today, and obviously Entro being one of the earlier ones in this market, as many of you know already. So we're seeing so many of this. One key thing I will say is at the very bottom that we're seeing, what I'm seeing from my research across these vendors is a big part is automated discovery and inventory. A huge part of why enterprises, for my research, are buying solutions is actually about automating that process of discovery and inventory. It's a big one because of just how fragmented NHIs are across different parts of your enterprise stack. And then the second piece is the life cycle management, and especially rotating secret rotation. That's a specific use case. It's a very difficult and cumbersome process. And enterprises and CISOs and even VP of identity that I speak to tell me this is one key reason why they need a vendor to help them around this. I won't speak too much about this. Cloud NHIs and microservices is an area that we're seeing a huge growth in and a big challenge for enterprises. I'm happy to share my slides, but this is increasingly becoming a problem. Machines and PKI and certificate management. I think this is an often neglected one, but we've seen this, and we've seen this with, if you're aware of CyberArk's acquisition of Venafi, for example, we're seeing this as a big emphasis, and it's not a sexy subject, but it's a very, very important part of the NHI plan, and it's something that I'm seeing emerging a lot this year. APIs are still a very, very big problem for enterprises, and a lot of my research is also showing that the explosion of APIs specifically, and enterprises are struggling around how they actually go about deal with it. And then the last piece here is just the compliance and regulatory drivers, right? On the slide, I do have a number of different regulatory drivers now that we're seeing that are picking up, that are going to, and I think throughout the rest of 2025, it will play a key role in driving this market forward, and why enterprises need some type of a solution to go about helping them solve their NHI problems today. So those are just the 5 major key trends that I did want to speak to. Now, I'm switching to the next half of my presentation, which is how are companies solving for this? Some of you might have known, like on the mature side of this is just looking at the whole identity ecosystem today, identity security as it looks at 2025. What we've seen is the last 20 years, all the way from the early days of Novell to Microsoft and all the big identity vendors, we know the process for securing the human identity lifecycle on the left is a fairly mature market. We have a number of solutions around that. I think ITDR is maybe the one that's been emerging in more recent years, and we're seeing the importance of that just because of what we know that's happening with stolen credentials or phishing types of attacks. So we know the left side of this is pretty mature with Microsoft, Okta, and all of the big human identity vendors. However, enterprises still don't have a good life cycle process for helping them on the right side as it relates to their non-human identities. And this is also a big reason why we don't have enough good solutions that actually could help you throughout that whole life. So for whatever types of NHIs you're dealing with, whether that's service accounts, whether that's how you go about managing your secrets, whether that's in your developer environment. And so this is a large part, and this is a large gap, and it's a key reason why I believe we need more vendors, such as many of the vendors in our room today, that are going to help us solve for that problem. And the big piece is, how do we automate that? How do we make that easy, especially for teams across enterprises? This is an ecosystem map. If many of you have seen some of my reports, you're probably very familiar with this map. In terms of when we think about identity security, these are the different fragments or different areas. Again, one thing I always love to warn people is I would never cover all the vendors on the market. So you might always see there's a vendor somewhere. There are many vendors globally in Asia, Europe, and all parts of the world. This is just a case study of what the market looks like and individual components of markets across human identities as well as non-human identities. And today, a big part of the NHI market is broken 2 parts. Based off my research, is more you could think of as the access management side of things, as what we're seeing with companies like Ambit early on from the presentation we saw. And then we have the governance side, specifically around the whole life cycle management. And that's a key ecosystem that we're seeing evolving from vendors right now today. And then when we go a little bit deeper into the non-human identity market itself, this is how this market is shaping up in and of itself. And quite frankly, where we are today, obviously, the big part of the market today is this 3 major sections, right? Like this is where most of the VP of identities that I speak to today are looking for some type of solution to help them. These markets are evolved. Like every enterprise I'm probably speaking to today, you probably have a couple of these solutions on the left. And companies are then really thinking about using those solutions to solve their problem. I will say the biggest difference of what I've seen with the leaders and identities I speak to as it relates to those 2 categories is for the cloud identity, where you have the human and non-human vendors, you might have examples of companies that maybe entitlements management, they really want to be able to map human identity back to an NHI, or they want to do that vice versa. And you see a key reason why they're adopting a number of those vendors at the bottom half of that. And then if companies have a lot of automated processes or have a lot of bots running, or just a huge amount of NHIs in the enterprises, they're looking for a pure play NHI vendor to help them automate that whole process. This is another ecosystem map that I have in terms of how I'm seeing the market shaping up. Again, it's a rapidly moving market. Different vendors are building different solutions to solve this. But in general, you could think of this market as coming into the human identity side of things. We know the non-human, you have the detection or more real-time focus, and then you have more of the governance in terms of taking preventative steps to go about preventing that. And so we're seeing different vendors building at different parts. And depending on an enterprise, no company has the same problem. Every enterprise has a very different problem. And so depending on the needs within your organization, we're seeing vendors adopt different types of vendors across this ecosystem. And then the last thing I'll probably just mention as it relates to where vendors are building solutions as of today, everyone wants to secure NHIs and whatever category of NHIs you have today. However, what we're seeing is companies are building off their strengths, right? So you do have some vendors who started as secret managers like Achilles or like CyberArk and some of these guys, and they're leveraging that same strength and expanding into other parts of the NHI ecosystem, right? Or you have your human identity vendors traditionally, which we've spoken about, building adjacent solutions and coming in. Like I don't know if Okta has released this, but a number of these vendors are releasing solutions and building solutions around NHI management. And then we have obviously the pure play vendors at the bottom. But the long story short of all of this is, if you're a practitioner today trying to decide on what vendor to actually help you go about this, there's no shortage of vendors on the market today. And so it all depends on the problem or the adjacent part of your stack that you're trying to solve. So that's my key takeaways are 5 major key trends that we're seeing today across, whether it's cloud, DevOps, APIs, PKI certificates, as well as a compliance case study. Number 2 is many companies are moving towards a buy over build. Companies are realizing that building this internally is extremely difficult. I have spoken to a few enterprises who have built some internal processes to help them manage this, but it's usually for a very small subsector problem. And the CISOs that are generally looking to solve this across their entire enterprise are buying and looking for one of the solutions. Again, all depending on the starting point on where your company is currently in terms of your life cycle. And then the last thing is just the biggest case study is around unified visibility. Visibility, inventory, and just getting a grasp and visible view of all your NHIs across your enterprise is continue to be like the biggest case study that we're seeing companies buy certain solutions. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I think I'm pretty much done, or okay. If there's any questions, I'll maybe just take it. Yeah. So just for everyone who's wondering about his question. Okay, yeah, his question, Sam, right? Oh, what's Egnar? Okay, I'm sorry if I forgot names. His question was specific around how many tools are too many for an enterprise, or for an enterprise thinking about solving this. Do they need multiple solutions or different types of solutions, considering the fact that they probably have something? Well, just based off the VPs of identities or just the identity leaders I've spoken to, I think the stack that's emerging now is you have some access management solution internally. You need that. Definitely, you need something for your privilege access management generally. The third, you need some type of governance solution. And then now what we're seeing is a fourth stack emerging around NHIs. And so I've spoken to a few identity leaders who are saying, hey, we have one of the number of the solutions that I've spoken about specifically helping us with visibility and just getting a good inventory of all of our NHIs that we have. How many do we have within our enterprises? What should we be tracking? How do we automate how we go about managing our secrets internally? So to your question, some companies are buying pure play NHI vendors, like the governance type solutions that I mentioned in my slides back. And then a few are like, you know what, well, we already are on one of these large human identity vendors, and but the problem is a number of those human identity vendors have been very slow to build NHI solutions. Not many of them have good NHI capabilities today. And so I'm seeing a case of like some are saying we're going to wait for our human identity vendor or access management solution to build something, and we're going to actually adopt this because it simplifies our stack. But for many of the forward-thinking CISOs, at least that I've spoken to, they're already buying. Some are already buying. Some have this on their roadmap for like later this year. Because again, it all comes down to the fact that it's a sprawl, right? You have NHIs in cloud, you have on-prem, you have something in SaaS, and to go about managing that, companies are realizing it's extremely difficult and they need some type of a solution. So that's but there's no perfect way. Every enterprise is very different today. Any final question?
I feel there are two paths to it, right? One, a modern system, if I'm doing something from scratch today, I think I can use a lot of the identity associated with the platforms in Azure and AWS. I think the problem becomes simpler. But most like I'm from a financial institution, we're like 400 years old, so we're always going to have legacy systems, right? So maybe deal with those problems separately. But my specific question is like, for human identities, we were used to doing entitlement management reviews and all. Is it even practical to do that with NHIs at scale, or should we say, depend on your ITDRs or look for anomaly detections and chase those and don't even go down the path of doing entitlement reviews at that scale?
Yeah. Do you want to just repeat the final half? There was just a noise that, but just the final half of that question.
Means the approach of doing, entitlement reviews or providing ownerships and all the stuff, is that something that should still be done with NHIs like we used to do for human identities?
Yeah, well, the role, the key of entitlement, I think there was a very good presentation early on from, I think it was Andromeda, that did speak very much to this. But in and around that entitlement mind, especially making that connection between human and non-human, or who's the developer who created, or who's responsible for leaking the secrets in GitHub, or one example of that. I think what we're seeing today, at least just in terms of the vendor ecosystem or how different leaders that I've spoken to, many of the NHI vendors actually have good capabilities. Some of them have good capabilities around this where you can actually map back the relationship and entitlement for each human back to an NHI. So some have that, but it's still not perfect. I would definitely say it's not perfect. And companies are still manually doing some of these. It's still not perfect, but we're not where we need to be in terms of being able to get their entitlements problem well. But many vendors are trying their best to solve this. Okay.